November 15th, 1884. The gas lamps are lit inside a grand hall on the Wilhelmstrasse. Outside, winter has come early. Inside, 14 men in dark frock coats lean over a map the size of a dining table. The map is almost entirely blank in its interior. Vast stretches of the continent labeled simply unknown. Otto von Bismarck stands at the head of the table. He is not a sentimental man. He gestures with a cigar toward the Congo Basin, a region larger than Western Europe, as if pointing at a plot of farmland to be subdivided between neighbors. No African leader is in this room, not one. The representatives of Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, Spain, and 6 other nations are drawing lines, real lines. Lines that will determine where families end and strangers begin, where languages get split, where kingdoms get cut in half, where cattle-herding communities who have moved the same roads for centuries will one morning find a border post and a soldier, telling them they cannot pass. The conference will last 3 months. When it ends, Africa as the world had known, it will be gone. And the consequences of that room, that table, those lines are still being lived today. If you find this documentary meaningful, consider subscribing and sharing it. History like this deserves a wide audience. Leave a comment with your thoughts. We read everyone. Now, let's go back much further than 1884. Long before Bismarck's cigar, before any European cartographer put ink to African soil, the continent was alive with political complexity that most school curricula still fail to capture. Understand the scale first. Africa is not a country. It has never been. It is the second largest landmass on Earth. Larger than the United States, China, India, and most of Europe combined. It contains deserts that dwarf nations, river systems longer than continents, and coastlines touching 2 oceans. Any honest conversation about African unity must begin by sitting with that geography and respecting what it actually means. And yet, within that scale, Africans built. By 800 CE, the Ghana Empire in West Africa had developed a sophisticated taxation system around the trans-Saharan gold and salt trade. Merchants from North Africa crossed the desert in camel caravans to reach Kumbi-Sala, the empire's capital, where the king's court could reportedly field an army of 200,000 men. This was not a tribal chiefdom. This was a state. The Mali Empire followed. At its height in the 14th century, Mali covered an area roughly the size of Western Europe. Its ruler, Mansa Musa, made a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, with a retinue historians estimate at 60,000 people and so much gold that when he passed through Cairo and distributed wealth along the way, he temporarily crashed the price of gold across North Africa and the Middle East. Medieval Arabic scholars documented this. It is in the historical record. Timbuktu, within Mali's sphere, became a center of Islamic scholarship where universities housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, not folklore, manuscripts, documents, many of which still exist today in the Ahmed Baba Institute. Then came Songhai, which absorbed Mali's territories and became the largest empire in West African history. Its administrative system divided the empire into provinces, each governed by appointed officials, answerable to the emperor. A bureaucratic structure recognizable to anyone who has studied Rome or the Abbasids. Move south. The Kingdom of Congo, centered in what is now northern Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo, was a highly centralized monarchy with a defined nobility, a taxation system, diplomatic relations with Portugal from the 1480s onward, and a legal tradition governing land and inheritance. When Portuguese missionaries arrived, they found a sovereign state. Letters between Congolese kings and the Vatican survive to this day. Move east. The Ethiopian highlands sheltered one of the world's oldest continuous Christian monarchies. The Zagwe dynasty and later the Solomonic dynasty maintained written royal chronicles, constructed monolithic stone churches at Lalibela that still stand, and preserved a literary tradition in Ge'ez, a classical language stretching back over a millennium. Ethiopia was never colonized. That is not an accident. On the Swahili coast, the long Indian Ocean shoreline of East Africa, city-states like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar were integrated into a trading world that stretched to Persia, India, and China. Chinese porcelain found in Kilwa ruins, Arab geographers describing Great Zimbabwe stone structures. The pre-colonial African world was not isolated, it was connected. Horizontally, across trade routes, across the Sahara and the ocean. And yet, here is the tension that must be named. These states, sophisticated, legitimate, powerful, did not think of themselves as one. The Malian emperor did not consider himself the ruler of the Swahili coast. The Congolese king did not share a political identity with the Oyo Empire to the north. The Oyo, who by the 17th century were fielding cavalry armies and controlling trade networks across what is now southwestern Nigeria and Benin, were sometimes in conflict with neighboring Dahomey. African states made war on each other. They formed alliances, they traded, they competed, exactly as states do everywhere. There was no unified African political consciousness. There were hundreds of distinct political traditions, languages, cosmologies, and governance systems, organized around ethnicity, religion, lineage, and geography, not around any idea of continental identity. That idea, Africa as one, would come much later, and it would not come from Africa. Return to that room in Berlin. The scramble for Africa. The rapid colonization of nearly the entire continent by European powers between roughly 1880 and 1914 is one of the most consequential geopolitical events in modern history. By 1914, only two African territories remained formally independent, Ethiopia and Liberia. Everything else, 10 million square miles of land, hundreds of millions of people, had been carved into colonial possessions. The Berlin Conference did not begin the scramble. It attempted to regulate it. European powers were already competing aggressively for African territory, and Bismarck convened the conference partly to prevent that competition from erupting into a European war. The conference established rules for recognized territorial claims, effective occupation, notification of other powers, free trade in the Congo Basin. What the conference did not do, what no one in that room even considered, was ask what the people living in those territories wanted, or how they organized themselves, or where their political loyalties already lay. The borders drawn were lines of European convenience. The Niger River was a natural highway of commerce and culture. The Berlin Act made it an international waterway, cutting across emerging colonial spheres with bureaucratic logic that ignored the Hausa, Fulani, Igbo, and Yoruba peoples whose lives depended on it. The Somali people, ethnically, linguistically, and culturally coherent, were divided between British Somaliland, Italian Somalia, French Djibouti, the Ethiopian Empire, and the British East Africa Protectorate that became Kenya. One people, 5 jurisdictions. The consequences of that division erupted into war in the 20th century and continue to shape the Horn of Africa today. The U people were split between British Gold Coast, which became Ghana, and German Togoland, which later became part of French-administered Togo. Families separated by lines they had no voice in drawing. In Central Africa, King Leopold II of Belgium was granted personal sovereignty over the Congo Free State, not as a Belgian colony, but as his private property. What followed was one of the most extensively documented atrocities of the colonial era: rubber quotas, severed hands as proof of punishment. Mortality estimates that historians place in the millions, the Congo's modern instability. Its extraction economy, its governance fragility, cannot be understood apart from what happened in that era. Nigeria deserves particular attention because it illustrates the structural problem with extraordinary clarity. In 1914, the British administrator Frederick Lugard amalgamated the northern and southern protectorates of Nigeria into a single administrative unit. The logic was fiscal efficiency. It brought together the predominantly Muslim Hausa Fulani North, with its emirate system of governance descended from the Sokoto Jihad of 1804, and the predominantly Christian and animist South, including the Yoruba kingdoms of the Southwest and the Igbo majority Southeast. These were not variations on a common theme. They were profoundly different political, religious, and cultural traditions. Lugard named this amalgamation Nigeria, a word reportedly coined by his companion, the journalist Flora Shaw, derived from the Niger River. The people inside its borders were not consulted. in the century since independence, Nigeria has experienced a civil war. The Biafran War from 1967 to 1970, in which estimates of deaths from conflict and famine range from 1 to 3 million, and persistent tensions that flow directly from the incompatibility of that colonial construction. Rwanda, the Belgian colonial administration, building on German precedents, hardened what had been fluid social categories, Hutu and Tutsi, into rigid racial classifications encoded in identity cards. Colonial racial science transformed a complex social hierarchy into a biological taxonomy. The identity cards those colonial officials issued were still in circulation in 1994. Historians who studied the Rwandan genocide are careful to say that colonialism did not cause it, but they are equally clear that the administrative architecture of ethnicity the Belgians built created conditions that genocide could exploit. These are not abstractions. They are documented consequences of borders drawn in Berlin by men who never saw what they were dividing. The idea of African unity as a political project did not emerge from pre-colonial Africa. It emerged from the African diaspora, and specifically from the experience of slavery. W.E.B. Du Bois, the African-American intellectual and activist, convened the first Pan-African Congress in London in 1900. Du Bois was born in Massachusetts. He had never been to Africa, but he understood, with a clarity born from living inside American racial hierarchy, that the dispersed African world shared a common condition and might share a common future. He organized Pan-African Congresses throughout the early 20th century, building a conversation across oceans. Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican-born activist, took the idea mass market. His Universal Negro Improvement Association in the 1920s attracted millions of members across the United States, the Caribbean, and Africa itself. Garvey's slogan, "Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad," was emotionally powerful and politically galvanizing in ways that Du Bois's more intellectual project was not. But it was Kwame Nkrumah who turned Pan-Africanism from a diaspora dream into an operational African political project. Nkrumah had studied in the United States and Britain. He had absorbed Garvey and Du Bois. He had read Lenin. He returned to the Gold Coast as a political organizer and led his country to independence in 1957, the first sub-Saharan African nation to achieve it from colonial rule. Ghana became a symbol. And Nkrumah was not satisfied with Ghana alone. In his 1963 address to the founding summit of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa, Nkrumah made his argument with the directness of a man who believed he was speaking into history. He told the assembled African leaders that they must move toward political union now, not gradually, not eventually, but immediately, because without it, they would remain economically dependent on former colonial powers. He argued that African nations individually were too small, too resource-dependent, too militarily weak to resist neo-colonial domination. Unity was not sentiment, it was survival strategy. The other leaders present were not convinced, and it is important to understand why. Because their resistance was not simply timidity. Leaders like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Sekou Toure of Guinea, and Haile Selassie of Ethiopia represented states that had fought. Through diplomacy, through political organizing, sometimes through blood, to achieve sovereignty. The idea of immediately surrendering that sovereignty to a continental government felt to many of them like exchanging one form of external control for another. Selassie himself, whose country had resisted Italian invasion at Adwa in 1896 and survived Mussolini's occupation, was particularly insistent on the primacy of state sovereignty. The compromise that emerged at Addis Ababa in 1963 was the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, and it was a significant compromise. The OAU was modeled on cooperation between sovereign states, not on political union. Its charter explicitly protected the principle of non-interference in member states' internal affairs. It recognized colonial borders. All of them, however arbitrary, as inviolable, because the alternative was a continental cascade of territorial disputes that everyone understood could become permanently violent. The OAU did real things. It provided diplomatic support to liberation movements against apartheid South Africa and colonial Portugal, It created frameworks for economic cooperation. It gave African diplomacy a collective voice in international forums. But it was not what Nkrumah had wanted, and Nkrumah knew it. In 1966, while he was traveling on a diplomatic mission, his government was overthrown in a military coup. He spent his remaining years in exile in Guinea, still writing, still arguing for continental union. He died in 1972 in Bucharest of cancer. The tension he identified between the dream of one Africa and the political reality of 54 separate sovereignties has never been resolved. It remains in 2024 the central unresolved question of African political development. This is where the documentary shifts register. Everything to this point has been history. What follows is analytical, grounded in real data but explicitly speculative, a serious thought experiment. What would a unified African state actually look like? Begin with the physical facts. Africa covers approximately 30.4 million square kilometers. To calibrate that, the United States is 9.8 million square kilometers. China is 9.6 million. India is 3.3 million. A unified Africa would be more than 3 times larger than any existing nation-state. Its nearest geographic comparison is not any current country. It is a comparison to the entire planet's largest existing political units combined. That geography contains extraordinary diversity of climate, terrain, and ecological zone, the Sahara Desert, larger than the continental United States, stretches across the north, below it the Sahel, then tropical rainforest, then highland savanna, then desert again in the south. Governing this range of physical environments with their completely different agricultural systems, infrastructure needs, and climate vulnerabilities from a single capital would be a challenge without precedent in human history. Now, population. Africa's current population is approximately 1.4 billion people, projected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050. It contains over 2,000 distinct languages, not dialects, languages. Linguists estimate that Africa accounts for roughly 1/3 of all human languages. The continent is home to hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, numerous major world religions, and governance traditions ranging from parliamentary republics to constitutional monarchies to systems with significant customary authority. For comparison, India, often cited as the world's most diverse democracy, has 22 official languages and 1.4 billion people. Managing that diversity within a federal framework has required one of the most complex constitutional architectures in history. And India has still experienced significant regional tensions, separatist movements, and governance crises over its 75 years of independence. Africa's linguistic and ethnic diversity is several multiples of India's. The European Union is another cautious comparison. The EU has 27 member states and has spent 70 years building toward economic and political integration. It still does not have a unified foreign policy, a shared military, or a common fiscal system. The EU's integration project has generated enormous prosperity and also Brexit near misses, and persistent disagreements about sovereignty that have repeatedly brought the project close to fracture. But here is the economic argument that consistently appears in discussions of African unity, and it deserves honest engagement. Africa's combined GDP in 2023 was approximately $3 trillion. That places it as a bloc, roughly alongside Germany or Japan. But that number dramatically understates the continent's economic potential. Africa holds an estimated 30% of the world's mineral reserves, including critical minerals like cobalt, lithium, manganese, and platinum that 21st century technology requires. It has 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. It has some of the fastest growing consumer markets on Earth. Demographically, it will be home to 40% of the world's working age population by 2100. Individual African nations negotiate resource contracts, trade agreements, and investment deals from positions of relative weakness because they are small markets with limited leverage. A unified entity, or even a deeply integrated trading bloc, would negotiate from a fundamentally different position. The African Continental Free Trade Area, which came into force in 2021, is an attempt to capture some of that leverage without requiring political union. If fully implemented, the AFCFTA would create the world's largest free trade area by number of participating countries and would potentially increase intra-African trade, currently among the lowest of any region in the world, by more than 50%. But implementation is the operative word. The AFCFTA exists on paper. The infrastructure, the roads, ports, railways, border systems, payment mechanisms, required to make continental free trade real is partially built and partially aspirational. A unified African state would face governance challenges of staggering complexity. Which language would be official? Swahili, Arabic, French, English, Hausa, Amharic, each with tens or hundreds of millions of speakers. All have claims. Where would the capital be? Any choice would be perceived as privileging one region. How would representation work? A federal system giving equal weight to each current nation would give a vote to Seychelles, population 100,000, equivalent to Nigeria's, population 220 million. A population proportional system would give Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt, and the DRC dominant influence, which smaller nations would resist. These are not rhetorical questions. They are the practical questions that have prevented African unity from advancing beyond aspiration. They are the questions the OAU's founders faced in 1963 and could not answer. They are questions the African Union continues to navigate today. The honest answer is, a single African state as a unified nation in the model of France or the United States is not currently politically achievable and may not be desirable even to most Africans, who tend to identify primarily with their ethnic community, their national state, and their regional neighborhood before they identify with a continental abstraction. That does not mean integration is impossible. It means the form of integration matters enormously. So what does it all mean? Africa was never one country, not before colonial rule, not during it, and not after. The idea that there was a single, unified African political identity waiting to be expressed, suppressed by colonialism and awaiting liberation, is a romantic projection that the historical record does not support. What the historical record does support is this: Africa contained sophisticated, legitimate, diverse political systems that were deliberately disrupted by a partition process designed entirely around European interests. The consequences of that disruption in governance fragility, in border conflicts, in the stunted development of intra-African trade, in the psychological violence of being told that your history began with someone else's arrival, are real, documented, and ongoing. Pan-Africanism at its most serious, in Nkrumah, in Du Bois, in the founding vision of the OAU, was not nostalgia for a unity that had never existed. It was an argument that unity could be built deliberately and politically as a response to the structural disadvantages that colonial fragmentation had created. It was a forward-looking project, not a backward-looking one. That project remains unfinished. The African Union, which replaced the OAU in 2002, has a more ambitious mandate than its predecessor. It has intervened in conflicts. It has sent peacekeeping missions. It has developed frameworks for democracy and human rights. It has launched the AFCFTA. It has Agenda 2063, a continental development blueprint. These are real institutional achievements. They are also insufficient to the scale of the challenge. The AU is underfunded, often unable to enforce its own decisions, and frequently paralyzed by the same sovereignty concerns that limited the OAU before it. African states spend enormous diplomatic energy negotiating with the EU, the United States, China, and Gulf states, individually, without the leverage that collective bargaining would provide. The future of African integration will not be determined by what happened in Berlin in 1884 or Addis Ababa in 1963. It will be determined by choices that African governments, African civil societies, and African citizens make in the coming decades. About infrastructure, about education, about governance, about trade, about what kind of political community they want to build. History does not predetermine those choices, but it does frame them. One African country? The question misses the depth of the real story. The real story is not about whether one line could replace 54. The real story is about what it means to build institutions across profound diversity. To find what is shared without erasing what is distinct. To create leverage without sacrificing the local political accountability that makes governance legitimate. That is not a story unique to Africa. It is the central problem of modern political life. But in Africa, it is being worked out at a scale and against a historical backdrop that has no precedent. The continent that no one in that Berlin room bothered to consult may yet write the most important chapter of the 21st century. The question was never whether Africa could be one country. The question is what kind of Africa Africans will choose to build and whether the world will finally get out of the way long enough to let them.